As most of you know, New Leaf is an organization that's largely grounded in yoga and mindfulness-based practices. So we're going to take a second as a community here to take just a few brief grounding breaths together. So wherever you find yourselves sitting or standing, just take a moment to make sure that you're comfortable. You can lower or close your eyes. And if it helps you connect to your breathing, you could bring one or both hands to your chest. Allow all of the air to empty from your lungs. And then take one of your fullest breaths in. And a comfortable but slow breath out. And two more breaths like this, just settling in from your day, becoming present for this conversation. And when you feel ready, you can lift or open your eyes. And I'm going to begin, most of our team members tonight are located in the Toronto area, and much of New Leaf's work takes place in Toronto. We want to take an important moment to acknowledge that Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We invite you because we know you're joining us from all sorts of different places. If you'd like to, in the chat, let us know where you're at, where you're from, where you are tonight, and if you want to provide your local land acknowledgement, that's appreciated as well. You can go ahead and type that in. Thank you so much for being here. Folks are going to continue to filter in. We had about 70 people sign up, so we'll probably see more people come in this virtual door. My name is Laura. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Executive Director of New Leaf Foundation, the organization that's hosting you tonight. Many of you know, but some might be new to New Leaf and getting to know us. Our organization has been supporting the wellness of young people in marginalized and underrepresented communities for about 13 years. And as an organization, we are deeply concerned about the experiences of traumatic and chronic stress that young people experience. And when we're considering those experiences, we have to include experiences of racism and oppression. And so this is what we're here to talk about tonight. And it's important, we've got to note, you know, with realness at the beginning of this call, the lack of justice that we saw yet again in the case of Breonna Taylor. And I just want to acknowledge that it's hard for a lot of folks to be here tonight and to show up. A lot of folks who have to keep showing up over and over again despite these experiences. And so thank you to all of our panelists for being here. Thank you to all of you for joining us. New Leaf works to create a space where we acknowledge and validate all feelings, especially the tough ones. So there's room for all feelings here tonight: anger, grief, sadness. But we also hope this conversation is a way for us to step additionally into like a sense of hope and possibility and change. So I'm very excited to also listen in with you tonight with this amazing, if I do say so, these friends and co-workers of mine on the panel, and our equally brilliant moderator, Rebeckah Price. And I'll just take a moment to introduce Rebeckah. So Rebeckah, if you don't know her already, is a wellness advocate who draws on her knowledge working in underserved, marginalized, and racialized communities in the US, in Canada, and the Caribbean. She's the founder of irise Yoga and Wellness, along with the Well Collective. And she has over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector, mainly as in community development and as an engagement specialist with a focus on strategies and policies related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Rebeckah is the first Black woman in Canada to represent the Nike brand under the trainer title, yay. and has supported New Leaf for the last few years. We're so lucky in her role on our advisory council. Please do check her out, read her full bio, because in the few minutes I have tonight, I cannot even come close to capturing the depth of her experience and all of the knowledge that she shares. So Rebeckah, I'm so happy to join you here tonight. I'm so happy that you joined us, and I'll pass it to you to guide us in this conversation.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the welcome and the grounding. Tonight, I just want to welcome all of you to this gathering as we gather here in community to learn, to discuss, to share, and to unload. Okay, so unload, unpack, and undo. And tonight, as we gather in this space, in this moment at this time, I'm gathering here with you as a friend, as a sister, as a community member, but most importantly, I'm gathering here with you all as a mother. And as someone who works in community with community and being a mother, I feel like we have to find better ways to show up for our children. I think that, you know, if we're talking about like the next generation, we need to do a lot more work around showing up better for our children, especially the children who come from marginalized communities, especially the children who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are racialized. We haven't really done a good job at like supporting them. And so these children are continuously just being left out, and they're not really supported by the structures that are in place to support them. So the structures aren't really there for them. And so I really wanted to acknowledge that, and that's the framework from how I'm entering this conversation with everybody tonight, and that's the framework from which I'll be operating, because that's the framework that is closest to my heart. But before we begin, I wanted to just take a moment to root deep into our breath as we hold a moment of silence for the mother of Breonna Taylor, because rooting in breath and being still, for me, is a form of resistance. So I just want to take a moment right here for us to pause for a moment of silence. When you're ready, you can take a nice deep inhale through your nose, fill yourself all the way up, and exhale out through your mouth. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel tonight because we get to have such an important conversation with such amazing people at this moment. And so before I begin, I would really like to acknowledge two people that I value their work, and you know, maybe I don't get to tell them that often, but I'd like to acknowledge Faith Jones and Michelle Miller for coming up with the idea just to host this panel and discussion, and for New Leaf's planning committee for conceptualizing the series. Getting a little verklempt, sorry guys. And so the goal of New Leaf's Schools in Session series is to continue the conversation about holding space to ensure that the movement that centers Black, Indigenous, and racialized bodies doesn't stop because it's no longer trendy. And we've been seeing that conversation happen over and over. For any of us who are involved in the work, these are the conversations that we have all the time, because, you know, beyond posting Black squares and hashtagging Black Lives Matter, like what else are we doing beyond that? And so these conversations are designed to move beyond the ideas and the acts of performing allyship into actual action. And that's why we're all here tonight. And so this conversation, which is a part of a larger series of conversations, is about creating pathways to understanding and to taking ownerships on the way that we individually and collectively show up against and support against anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-oppression work. And the work, as we all know, of New Leaf goes beyond just yoga, mindfulness programs, and is rooted in community and is designed by community and demonstrates the importance that wellness is a holistic and interconnected practice. And I really want to focus on that because like New Leaf does a really good job at really highlighting that. And we have to be able to acknowledge all these facets in order to support changes in systems, as well as support breaking down oppressions. So New Leaf's work of addressing the wellness of youth in underrepresented communities is rooted in understanding of how trauma, oppression impact young people. And in order for us to support change in those systems, we have to figure out ways to better engage the youth. So because we're collectively gathered here tonight in this space, I want to ensure that it is a safer space for all of us to share and to learn and to reflect. So with that being said, on your screen, you should be seeing a list of agreements that are encouraging everyone to, like, the way that we're going to participate in the conversation tonight. So if you don't see it, I'll just go ahead and say them too as well, which is to speak from your own experience using I statements. Speak for yourself and not for others. Instead of needing to be right or wrong, because sometimes that's just how we operate from, make room and space for a varying experiences, opinions, and differences. Ask for support or clarification when you need it. Remember that we aim to create an inclusive and safe space for all. While we are all learning, and there will be times that we call each other in, any explicitly racist, homophobic, transphobic, fatphobic, and other oppressive language will not be tolerated. And you're also being provided with a glossary of terms, of key terms, should they be needed as a way to support. And a couple of other quick things. We're going to be having a round of questions, following up with Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions or questions come to you throughout this whole entire discussion, take a moment just to format those questions, put it in the chat, and then we'll go ahead and address them at the end of this call. We may not, because the amount of people that are engaged in this conversation, get to every single one of your questions. So I just want to really be mindful and highlight that. We might have space for like 5, 6, we're not too sure, but don't let that be a barrier for you to be able to just ask away. And if you are sharing your experience or just knowledge about what you've gained from this whole entire conversation tonight, feel free to share that on any social media and just use the hashtag SchoolsInSession and the handle New Leaf Foundation TO. Thank you everybody for being here. So we're going to jump right into it. And with that being said, Jamilah, Can you please take a moment to unpack the title of what the panel's all about? Power is Present and what anti-oppression is.
Yeah, so, we're like riffing on attendance and just trying to think about how power is at play in the classroom, at schools, in the library, cafeteria, in exchanges between students, between teachers and students, between parents and administration, that power is happening all the time, right? So like, maybe we understand the role of teacher-student having authority and hierarchy embedded into it, but really it's happening between everyone. So like we could think about between students, like bullying, right? This is happening and it's happening along race, it's happening along class, it's happening along gender, right? And thinking about how a lot of students that we serve at New Leaf have like intergenerational trauma. They come from backgrounds where their parents are refugees, are immigrants, have experienced, a myriad of things that we want to just try to be mindful of, right? So anti-oppression really simply is the recognition that power exists and can cause harm. And I think if we like look around the world, we're seeing a lot of abuses of power, right? And thinking about how the school is a microcosm, when the kids go for lunch, when New Leaf is really working in schools often where police are really present. And we just want to be careful and mindful as teachers. So we teach anti-oppression in our training. And New Leaf was always, to me, an organization that had this front of mind, not in a way of jargon, but the first time I heard Laura speak, she said, our teachers teach in communities where they do not live, right? Like I go into detention centers and that's not my experience. And so what New Leaf was saying, what I understood and we talk about is how we don't want to replicate like a charity model, right? So there's like a ton of white saviorism that can come into play, these like colonial relationships of helping and fixing. And at New Leaf, we really want to be remembering how our students are the experts in their lived experience and really respecting them as such. And so our training teaches teachers how to be mindful of their own bias, of their own assumptions, so that when we go to serve racialized students, we're not reading the room without thinking of what we're bringing into it, right? Like, there's a section in our training about unpacking our own stuff, right? Like, what is the way that we're going to maybe mistake hunger for lethargy or disengagement, right? We really want to be thinking top of mind, even as an organization, like, how do we portray students in our promotional materials, right? So when I worked with Christiane Slomka, who's here, hi, we talked about this question: are we interrupting or perpetuating power in everything we do? And so New Leaf is really thinking about that in their work. And I really respect us for always having that in mind, even in the ways that we as an organization relate to our funders, relate to our students, and the ways that we train teachers to go in and be present with power happening in the classroom.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think it was really important for us to kind of like unpack that too as well, because sometimes we might not see the interrelationship between power and privilege and how easily it shows up. And I really like the way that you highlighted that schools can cause harm. And sometimes we just think that schools is like a space for like children and youth to go and to be and to thrive and to learn and become educated, but we don't necessarily take the opportunity to see that there might be certain like physical things and structures that are in place, and then non-physical things and structures, like you said, like lethargy, like are they being lazy or are they hungry, right? And there's a clear distinction about that. And I'm really glad that you took the opportunity to like unpack that and highlight that for us, because it's a really good segue for us to get into our next question, which I'm going to ask Bernice. And how do experiences of racism show up in early life, and how can these experiences affect child development and parent and child relationships?
Thanks for that question, Rebeckah. And yeah, that was really helpful, Jamilah, as I was thinking about this writing. So I'm coming from, and I really like the way you set the tone about you're coming from this as a mother and, you know, some of your own experiences. So I'm coming from this, and I'm trying not to be too theoretical, but I'm coming from this also as a mother and as an early child educator. And thinking about the work that takes place in these settings. So I'm really focusing on early child education and childcare programs, early learning and care programs. So I'm, again, trying not to sound theoretical, but you know, what we do know based on studies and more research is that the stress that the mother experiences during pregnancy has a direct impact on the infant, in utero, that we recognize that all of this chronic stress affects mom and then affects the infant by way of the interactions with the neurological development. So we often see children who are at risk for learning disabilities. We see preterm birth, you know, early birth, low birth rates. We see experiences of racism that leads to chronic stress and inflammation, right? So hormones in the body that also increases the rate of diseases like heart disease and diabetes and depression as children get older, if they're not the right kind of supports in place. We see mental health issues, which might present as behavioral issues. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this in childcare. So the child might have some difficulty regulating emotions. They appear to be hypervigilant in the classroom, difficulties focusing, hyperactivity. Really what the child is trying to tell us is they're not feeling safe. They're not feeling validated. It's difficulty to trust their instincts because it's difficult to trust adults, particularly those educators who often may underestimate their behavior, underestimate their skills, not recognize what the child is trying to tell us. And so they struggle on their own. These children don't ask, you know, my child doesn't ask for help, right? Doesn't trust these adults in the environment, in the school environment, in the childcare environment. they often are viewed from a deficit lens. And so any behavior gets identified as a problem, as an issue. And these children are often referred then for special ed, for an assessment, because there's something wrong with their behavior. Whereas the child who's not from a racialized community, who's not a Black child, who might be a white child, you know, the behavior's, it's silly, that's okay. People look the other way, we minimize it, but you know, we focus this attention on the Black child. And we also need to be aware that children are quite sensitive, and they're aware of these microaggressions, the rolling of the eyes. You know, when their parent shows up, it's like, oh, you know, as opposed to educators being happy to see them. It's the judging that happens. It's, you know, who gets to sit on the teacher's lap, who gets to help with different activities around the classroom. Children pick these things up. So what happens is these deficit images are bombarding them on a day-to-day basis, and it's the self-fulfilling prophecy. They start to internalize it and believe that they don't have any worth, they don't have any value. So they start to give up. In terms of the child who might have been diagnosed, who might have a diagnosis of autism, for example, I can't tell you how many children I've seen. Typically, it's young Black boys who are wandering aimlessly around the classroom, the childcare program, because it's, well, you know, there's not much we can do about them. And the parents haven't been able to advocate for them. And so they're left to their own devices. There's no belief that intervention is going to help them. In terms of relationships, again, parents, you know, this race-related stress that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, they're using all their resources to support their own emotional needs, trying to prove themselves every day, to try to prove their own worth, their own value. So it leaves little left for their child. You might find that they're questioning, you know, parents are questioning their own parenting skills. They're hard on themselves. They're hard on their child. They're having difficulty regulating their own emotions. They're suspect to this fallacy of belief, fallacy of perfection or unreasonable expectations that get placed on themselves and their children. You know, how many times, right, as the child here, you've got to work harder than the other children, you're Black. You've got to try double, you know, you've got to work twice as hard to be successful, to be recognized. So as a result, the parent-child interactions, right, are interrupted or influenced. Parents find it difficult because of this stress, because of this pressure to be in the moment and to really enjoy being with their child. Again, not trusting their own parenting skills, so they tend to isolate themselves. It's, you know, it's a possibility of not trusting others and not seeking out those supports, not enjoying those community events and community opportunities to be with others and to connect, because you're so preoccupied about being judged. So, you know, those are some of the kind of highlights. I wanted to, you know, give space for my colleagues to weigh in, because I know they have some insights as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernice, for sharing. And you've highlighted so much. And I feel like there's so many other people on the panel who can add on to this conversation, because, you know, working in the schools, you might have seen additional stuff. Is there anybody else who'd like to add on to what Bernice has said?
Crickets. I know that's awkward. I do have something to add, but I know because I'm going next, it might make sense for me to just wait, because I wanted to say, going off on what Bernice said. So I really am going to add on something that you said, because it so supports where I'm going to go with my portion. So my head is on fire with what I want to say. So trust me, it won't be crickets.
I just want to add, like, I just feel like Bernice touched on so many things, and I feel like, you know, like, even as a parent, I've walked into spaces where I've seen other parents be welcomed, and then other parents, like, sit here, or like, oh, here she comes again, or, you know what I mean? And how has that made me feel in terms of, like, and I feel that I have a very strong voice, and sometimes I think, you know, administrators at my children's school just are afraid of me. But I mean, like, you know, I think that at the same time, it's really important for us to acknowledge that those experiences are very isolating too as well, right? And then you kind of feel like with Bernice, you kind of hinted at is that you do feel alone. And when you feel alone, you kind of like stick to yourself too as well. And then what does that do in terms of that powerlessness feeling that you may have, where you might not even feel like you can be in a position to go into a space and advocate for your child, because like what is really good that is going to come out of it, right? So, I really want to highlight that too as well. And something else that you said, Bernice, which is around like that idea of feeling safe, right? And so if your child's not feeling safe, then even as a parent, how can you walk into an environment, and how do you reinforce that idea of being safe to your child when there's example after example of like it not being like safe for them to like be in that space and to thrive. And with that being said, I mean, Cherilyn, I know you're like ready to go. She's like, I'm ready to go. So, and you have a very unique experience because you are an administrator. So technically speaking, we're really unpacking the way that you hold space and community for community within a school structure. So I want to know, like, can you explain how, in your opinion, how schools oppress students and the impact that you see this having on young people?
For sure. The point I wanted to jump off with from Bernice is when you spoke so perfectly about the fact that they state that sometimes Black children can't regulate emotion. And if you look at learning skills, when you look at the report card and you look at learning skills, the one learning skill that people constantly speak about is self-regulation. And as a learning coach, when I was a principal coach, I was constantly in meetings where people wanted to talk about the Black students and self-regulation. And I would want to jump from the ceiling, say, whoa, 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 wait a second, where is that coming from? I'm in a very interesting position because I am part of the organization which oppresses youth. I am part of that, which means I am complicit, which means I engage in activities daily which harm individuals, including myself. I don't fit in when I walk into a school. For example, I'm a school principal. Doesn't matter about the title. I never wanted to be a school principal because I didn't believe that somebody like me could be a school principal. And anytime I walk into a new school or a new space as principal and I do not announce who I am always approached with, are you delivering something today? Are you the supply teacher? Please go. Sometimes if I dress down, because I know I look younger than I am, which is fabulous, it's, can you please move out of the hall because, or my favorite, the principal wouldn't want you to walk in the halls because, who told you to say that on my behalf when I never told you to say it? Like, that is so my experience. And for that reason, I don't dress the part. I will do whatever I want with my hair. I might wear a head tie because students are suspended for wearing head ties, and I'll do it on purpose. My point is, when I'm at home, I'm free. I have a daughter, she's 15 months. She is free. She can dance, sing, communicate with me, talk with me. We have big, big conversation. And then we go to school and we're told to line up, sit down, be quiet, raise your hand. I go to a structure that is a place that's structured like jail. And I'm taught to make sure that I'm doing things in alignment with the prison system. And if I don't do those things in that way, I'm punished. I'm somebody who is successful or perhaps holds power, but at all experiences that I've had in the education system, I've been regulated to not be free and not be myself. In kindergarten, that looked like I talked too much. But at home, I was always able to talk. In grade 4, it looked like I sang too much. But at home, I sang to understand things. In grade 8, it was that I always was calling and responding when the teacher spoke. But call and response for me, when I'm hearing a scripture or hearing a message that's powerful, I am going to raise my hand and say, amen, let's go, let's get it. But at school, I'm not allowed to do that. And because I'm not allowed to do that, and here I am, I'm the principal, and I'm getting mad at students who don't do those things, I am part of the problem. I'm complicit. Schools don't operate in a way that allows particular students to be free. Now, multiply that when I walk into a school space, I see educators who do not look like me or identify with me or talk about my experiences. I do not read about my experiences. I'm suspended for things that I normally do at home, which I'm celebrated for. School is going to oppress me day after day after day. And even in leadership, I will tell you, I don't fit in. I never feel like I fit in. I don't want to fit in. And that's growth on my part, because I think I've fought so long in education and in schools to fit in, and I just can't. I'm not the circle that fits into the box. So I look at our structures and the way we set up school. I look at how we teach students when to speak and when not to speak. I look at our response to students who need to learn differently because at home they never learned the way that we told them to learn. I think the problem is this: schools can change at the drop of a dime, but they refuse to. And the reason I say that is because of COVID, we have changed our scheduling. We have changed how we teach. We have changed who teaches. We have changed the platforms. We have changed the educational resources that we use. We are now looking at anti-oppression and different things. We have changed at the drop of a dime because people who do not look like me have said we need to change, we ought to change. Well, then why have we not changed as a school system in response to the people who look like me, who constantly say, you're not serving me or meeting my needs, we need to change? You see, I say all of that to say my answer isn't recorded, and I didn't want to have the straight A answer because I'm not chat that way. I wanted to make sure I spoke from my heart, and that's how I am. But I know that schools continue to oppress individuals because the very structure of school that allows a student to be successful is one that does not celebrate difference, acknowledge difference, or allow students to be different. It punishes them when they are. I know we're going to that place in our board where we want to do better in that way, but going to that place to do better requires that individuals who have been oppressed lead that work. But in leading that work, it's traumatic because then you got to go back to that place where you're like, okay, I'm going to lead it, but I'm going to lead it while I'm crying because I remember I was oppressed yesterday and then I can't lead it. Like, let me tell you, there's a lot that we need to do as a school system. And I see a lot of you nodding, which allows me to feel like I'm not talking a bunch of nonsense, but really and truly, there's so many places to go. And I'm not going to overtake this conversation because there's so much more to talk about. But that's my brief conversation about how schools oppress. And we need to do better. Me too included, because I'm part of the system.
I just feel like we need to take a nice deep breath. Like a nice deep breath after that one. And on top of that, I kind of feel like we just went to church. Like we just went to church. Someone's running up and down the aisles, like, like, you know what I mean? Like a full sermon. You just dropped a full sermon. And we have Annika in the comments in the chat saying school isn't supposed to be a polite form of incarceration. Right? And that's like really powerful in terms of like how you're showing up in these spaces. And I know I really appreciate the fact that you highlighted, you know, kind of like the position that you are in, right? And how it is a very precarious position to be in, but it's also a very powerful position for you to be into as well, because like you don't see that many administrators who look like you, right? I think the first time I seen a Black administrator is when I send my kids to the Afrocentric school, right? And that was like, you know, and so I really think that, you know, even though I understand the precarious nature of the space that you occupy, it's really important space for you to occupy to begin with. Does anybody want to add on to what Cherilyn said? I'm seeing Jamilah saying, oh, we're good. Does anybody else on the panel want to contribute or add? Yeah, I really think that, you know, really, Cherilyn, you really tied it back to what Bernice was saying in terms of like the spaces, the harm, the trauma that, and I also think that even like as a parent occupying that space, like I recognize that each of my children learn differently, right? And I have a child who's very vocal, who's very like, he stands up for himself, and it's not that he's defiant. that's just, and I've cultivated that in him, but I'm also acutely aware of how that shows up. And I'm also acutely afraid of when that's going to show up at the wrong time with the wrong person, right? And so I'm treading that precarious space of, telling them to show up in your fullest expression of yourself. Don't shrink yourself. But then I'm also aware of the fact that like the spaces that he's going to occupy are spaces they're going to see him standing up and affirming his existence as defiance and as a threat. And like that also kind of like leads back to the idea of like, what is the norm? And if you don't fit in to that conventional understanding of norm, what does that really mean for us at the end of the day, right?
Sorry, I just want to echo that exactly. I just, I was thinking of being a parent, and everything you said, Cherilyn, it's just, I mean, this is it, right? And I'm looking forward to when we start talking about what can we do, because being silent and internalizing this, right, is so damaging. So thanks for.
And actually today I was talking to Rochelle, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but I was also kind of like unpacking to her how like this whole COVID thing has really impacted like parents, right? And I was disclosing to her that I had worked on something, and just like the fact that even as like the structures that are in place didn't understand that there's like mental health supports are needed for parents just as much as the $200 check that you got in the mail or like e-transferred to be able to support your child. Like, you know what I mean? It's stressful. Like I can't help my kid with grade 8 math, like straight up. Like I was really good in English, and that's why I never became a doctor, right? Because I sucked at math. Like, you know what I mean? And I can own that and be honest with myself. But like, what are we doing to be able to support parents who may not have access to computers, who may not speak English, right, as their first language, who may not have, who are like me, who are like deathly afraid of looking at numbers, right? Like, you know what I mean? And like, what supports and support systems are we, doesn't mean that I'm not actively engaged in my child's education. It just means that I occupy a space where like, I know my limitations and I'm okay with that, but I also need those supports, right? And how do those show up too as well? And I think that would be a really good segue to really kind of really hone in terms around that support space, especially within the structures of the schools. Jamilah, as a longtime youth program facilitator working with New Leaf and in others in schools and community spaces, how have you seen racism and other forms of oppression play out towards young people?
Yeah, so I think, I just want to, oppression might be a word for people, they're like, what does that even mean? And it could just be understood as unjust treatment or the exercise of authority, right? So when's it happening? How's it happening? You could think there's like a few levels. Interpersonally, it's happening. So I go in to teach and it's an embodied practice, and fat phobia comes up, ableism comes up, gendering, misgendering, and really like overly gendering students by saying things like guys instead of saying everyone, right? And reinforcing patriarchy in that way. And institutionally, it's really happening a lot in the schools. So, disproportionately who's in detention, right? Who's being punished, who's being policed, a kind of like surveillance happening inside of the school, inside of the classroom, punitive forms of just justice instead of thinking about more restorative forms of justice in the classroom, and like internalized. So we talked about how the young people really start to see themselves as a problem because they understand they're perceived as problems. And there's like a bajillion kinds of diagnoses, right? So New Leaf teachers go in and we meet with teachers and administrators, and they'll tell you, okay, this person's in your class, this person has X, Y, Z. This person has A, B, C. And I just sometimes say like, I don't actually want to know. Please don't tell me. I'm going to go in, I'm going to meet the kids. Because then this is what happens, right? I remember teaching this lovely young Black woman who was like bright and engaged and like great with other students, and really helped me as a teacher lead a successful class. And then, a couple of weeks in, a teacher checked in with me and started describing a student who was a bully, who was aggressive, and who was a problem. And this was my favorite student. And I was like, are we talking about this? I don't actually know who you're describing at all, you know? And it's really hard because at least that young person had this kind of openness to me and openness to the practice to come in and be themselves instead of identifying with that diagnosis and that perception that is swirling around them, right? And, you know, one thing that happens a lot is there's like, I'm gonna just say it, there's a ton of white women in the school system, right? It's like really overly populated, the social workers, the teachers, the administrators, lots of white women. And I'm, you know, I don't know, it's like a dangerous minds, like kind of white saviorism. Like they've seen Jodie Foster and they're like, I'm gonna go in and save these racialized rough youths, you know? And then they come to find out it's not the movies. And then they kind of double down on their racism and they're like, these are bad kids, right? And sometimes it's kind of more benign. This is my least favorite thing that I see happen all the time. Okay, there's like misappropriation of AAVE, African American Vernacular English, AAVE, right? And it happens towards me, which is annoying to me because it's misidentifying me. I'm Nigerian and Indo-Trinidadian. I'm not African American, but teachers, these often white women, come in and they're like, yes, queen, your braids are on fleek, you know, and they want to like throw around these words. And the kids are stressed. Yes, I'm serious. It's like really annoying, right? The kids are like, I'm not a caricature. I'm not a stereotype. Because you watch some show on TV, you don't come in here and speak to me that way. And it's like, of course I know I got my braids did. Like, don't you have anything else to say to me than like about my new braids, right? Like it's maybe like on that range, but it's really I see it over and over in the school system. And I worry about these women who think they're like helping and relating and being cool when actually it's just really uncomfortable and racism.
Yeah, and I think like, you know, it's like that Jesus mentality, the savior complex. That's what, you know, we like to call it, the savior complex, in terms of like really just putting people in a box, like Cherilyn had mentioned before, and like, I'm here to do all these things. And you know, sometimes I always used to say, like, when I worked in schools, like, it would be really great if teachers could go for like anti-oppression training and get interviewed every year before they come back to the job, right? Because, you know, they, regardless of whatever they want to say, they are influenced by what they think or see or hear, right? And they bring those preconceived notions with them to their work. And they may not, maybe it's an uncomfortable space to acknowledge it, but like, you know, really try to find that space within to check your biases too as well, right? And what stereotypes and biases are you buying into and feeding into, like, when you walk into that space, or when you walk into that understanding of how you perceive people to be in that space, right? Everybody, like, all these kids' parents are single mothers, like, you know what I mean? Like, or like, everybody's poor, everybody's this, or everybody's that, like, you know, and I think that creates a very static notion and understanding of the communities in which they're working in, right? And you know, that within itself needs to be a lot more fluid. Does anybody else on the panel want to add on to what Jamilah just highlighted? Feel free.
Well, just to add to what you highlighted, Rebeckah, it just in terms of oppression in school spaces is exactly that, of intersections. And I think that the limitations of viewing a population or youth within, you know, urban priority schools as one thing, the viewpoint of that in of itself is oppressive, like across, whether it's staff, whether it's other parents, whether it's youth. I think that teaching across the board sort of needs to be addressed. I'll jump into that more in mine, but I just naming like that people are not one thing, youth are not one thing, parents are not one thing. And yeah, I'll jump into it more after, but that labeling, like that runs deep. And I don't think people realize how important it is to check one's personal bias, as you name, and how that's where it first starts, because that's the internal work that has to be done and can do big things. But I'll go into it.
Thank you, Julia. I just want to highlight a quick story before I get, actually, Julia, I'm going to ask you a question next. When I was in high school many moons ago, I had a English teacher. We were reading The Heart of Darkness, so that should date how old I am. The English teacher asked me to bring in African drum music to set the tone of Africa. I was the only Black kid in my school. And I was like, what did you just say? And you know, if anybody's read The Heart of Darkness, it's basically like the Bible for validating the idea of colonialism and going into countries and plummeting them. And so I did a project on the Belgian Congo, and I finished my project by saying like there were 16 million Congolese people in Congo before the Belgians got there. And then, you know, by the end there was like 1 million. So you tell me who the real savages are. Every single day I had to go to class. We sat and heard people call Black people cannibals, Black people savages. And every single day I would have my white peers look at me. And not once did that teacher ever stop to think about the harm that caused me. And I got in trouble and I got sent down to the principal's office. And I almost got suspended and expelled for highlighting something that to me was clearly racist and really like offensive. And you're not even teaching it within the context of like teaching the history behind the book before you decide to unpack it for a class. Because then all my white peers, my white friends that I'd grown up with, now we're like, oh, like Black people are cannibals, Black people are this, Black people are, you know what I mean? And those are simple like things where the teacher was probably thinking like, oh, Rebeckah, she's Black. And she probably listens to like African music. So I'm just gonna ask her to bring in some drum music. We're gonna set the tone of Africa and call it a day, right? And not once did anybody ever check in and think about that, right? And so like, those are little ways, like, and I'm thinking about that, and that was years ago, and how that showed up for me. And then thinking about like, if I didn't have a parent who advocated, or I was in a position to advocate for myself, because I was very militant at a very young age, like what would have happened, right? And what would have been my relationship with the education system, based upon that one experience of multiple experiences that I experienced, right? And so like when we're thinking about this, especially from the perspective of educators, you know, think about the harm that it is when someone says like your hair looks on fleek, or you look lit, or like wagwan, like, no, like really, like, you know what I mean? That does cause harm, and that also does cause a lot of trauma. And Julia, I want to ask you, when we are thinking about that within that context, and when we view racism within a trauma framework, particularly when experiences of racism occur throughout many generations, what are the potential impacts and on families and on communities?
I just want to name that, thank you for sharing your story, because I just want to point out that that is your story and your heart, and listening to everyone on the panel that's spoken so far, that is the impact of intergenerational trauma, of stories, who gets to tell the stories, who is absorbing the stories, and whose voices get left out. And so the fact, just even the fact that you had to sit through that, so if we just sort of name trauma and what you felt, you even telling that story, you know, I invite people on the call to answer, like, how did that make you feel? Like, I felt it in my chest, I felt it in my stomach, I felt it in my throat. And trauma is the experience of like force imposed and a lack of choice and a lack of voice. And it's the inability to, you know, correct something, an experience that has happened. And so that experience can come up at any moment because it's never been resolved. So when we look at intergenerational trauma and we look at Black and Indigenous peoples, there is a transmission of experience that is ever present. So I think that the impact of that in schools for our youth, you know, who are learning, who are being treated in a certain way, whether it's being stereotyped, stigmatized, looked at a certain way, and not being given equal opportunity to, I guess, heal, grow, and evolve. You know, when punitive or penalty goes on, that is intergenerational trauma. So I'm going to back up briefly. If we all look at our personal experience of trauma, everyone has had a trauma, whether it's big or small. So if you think about a death in a family, if you think about somebody, even a relationship that ended short, like severely, or was cut short. If you think about a family member going to jail or not being at home, if you think about something happening to your child that was beyond your control, there are many ways that you can think about trauma and be like, yes, that is something that still haunts me every year. That is something, every time I hear that song, I cry. So I'm painting that picture of trauma in a big way, just so everyone here, regardless of where you're from, what your race is, that we can all relate to that. There's stuff that digs us. Okay. So now when we're thinking about intergenerational trauma and we're thinking about races or entire population, I think it's so important to really recognize that it is something, intergenerational trauma is when, and I'm going to read this, but it's when negative consequences across generations get handed down in that experience. So if we take Indigenous peoples, if we look at the residential schools, if we look at laws that were passed, the impacts of those were not so long ago, they get passed down. If we look at segregation, okay, if we look at Black segregation, I was like looking at it earlier, 1983 in Canada was the last desegregation of a school. I was born in 1983. And so I think it's so important that we challenge, why are we talking about this? This happened, you know, people like to distance it. And that really, you know, and Jamilah brought this up, this is where power is at play. We get to distance ourselves from it, right? If we're in positions of power and it doesn't impact us. And guess what? What was segregation, you know? What was colonization? What were all those things? It was literally a lumping, a grouping, pillaging, taking away of culture. There was so much stripping. There was a stripping in the narrative, and the impacts of that on health, on the way we educate our youth, on the resources that youth have, that Black youth have, that Indigenous youth have. There is going to be a catch-up game. You know what I mean? And I think that it's just in that question, when we're looking at schools, when we are educating people, I think it's important to not undermine why we have to acknowledge these things. We can acknowledge growth and areas of growth and the way that things have done well, but we also then need to acknowledge that, yes, what within the last 40 to 50 years, you know, of real movement. And I think that in looking at schools and when that comes up, trauma or intergenerational trauma, we need to sort of find a compassionate lens around that. So from a mindfulness perspective, and when we go in, it is a matter of being able to look and look again. So if we take that principle of looking for the first time, that's where we need to check our own biases of the way we look. And, you know, I'll speak as a West Indian woman. Racism exists across races, right? And so I have an experience of racism. My ancestry will have an experience of that, and will have a very negative experience, you know, whether it's indentureship, but and I always challenge people within my own race, within other races, right? Because they're, if we're looking at racism, you can use that as a way of relating, but we cannot compare it as exactly the same. So I think that in intergenerational trauma, it is so important that we acknowledge that there are disparities that Black and Indigenous populations face. There is a need for greater education. And as my teacher, Jane Middleton Moss, says, she's an Indigenous teacher, there is such an importance of bringing youth back to their culture. And Cherilyn said this earlier, I wanted to jump in. Schools the way that they are now, it is like or someone said it too, like a polite jailing. And that is sort of a sterilization of culture. And if youth don't have that culture, and if they don't have that sort of connection, right, that's celebrated at home, and they only see that in one space, but it's not celebrated globally, then there's always going to be this splitting, and there's always going to be an expectation on our youth, on our racialized young people that isn't fair, and that's unjust. And I think that, just sort of to end on that, and as tools for intergenerational trauma and how to look at that, is that personal looking, as I ask all parents, all educators, everyone working with youth, is when you look again and notice the way that you pigeonhole, the way that you stereotype, because it's going to happen. It's happened for so long. We're conditioned. Everyone on the call right now, we're conditioned to think a certain way. And it's just a matter of like, wow, these are the limitations. These are the limiting beliefs we place on young racialized people. This is intergenerational trauma. And one way that I can change that is by being more open-minded and by listening and being opening to challenge our expectations of behavior, and perfection. So I'll just.
Thanks, Julia, for just highlighting the correlation between how limiting beliefs are connected to trauma and also create and support harm and trauma. Does anybody else on the panel want to add on to what Julia said before I go on to Arabi? Okay. And again, just a gentle reminder, you can always use the chat to pop in questions for any questions that we may have at the end for Q&A. We welcome questions from the audience. I'm seeing a lot of comments just coming in through the chat. So feel free to take the advantage of having all these experts here to be able to ask questions to. Arabi, how do you think, as someone who's been through the whole entire New Leaf and been involved in New Leaf, as someone who's been in school and been involved with New Leaf in that way, how do you think the issue of access to resources like community programming is connected to racism? And what do you see as some of the consequences for BIPOC youth as a result of having unequal access?
Thank you, Rebecca. I would just like to thank everybody for bearing their heart and being vulnerable, and and everything I'm hearing, I feel it in my heart, and I thank you all, because this is the real life, this is the real school, this is the stuff that enriches our lives and needs to be more everywhere. So my name is Arabi Rajeswaran. And it's a Tamil name, and I say it in Tamil, and I've learned to say it in Tamil. But when I was in school, I was told to anglicize my name. So I'll just jump off of that, because, if we look at community resources or community programming in a healed world, in a world where we don't have intergenerational trauma, in a world where we're not dealing with these oppressive structures, all people can say, this is something I'm passionate about, and be led to pursue it. When we look at people who have experienced trauma, when we look at people who might not have the language to articulate that they're experiencing trauma, this motivation or desire to access programming might not even be there for the individual. Rebeckah, you mentioned we're all experts, right? And I'm a firm believer that we're all experts of our own experience. So for these young people in different communities, they're the expert of what programming they need and what programming they want. So whether it's a Black youth, an Indigenous youth, a youth of color, a straight youth, a queer youth, a trans youth, they know what they need. And the consequences for them not getting that are extreme. The consequences of that, I'll use 4 terms and then I'll explain them in detail. We can have attack self, attack other, avoidance, and withdrawal. With attack self, you have a lot of young people who, normalize substance abuse or self-harm. We have, when attack others, we have a lot of young people who maybe don't know how to articulate that they're hurting, but know how to raise their voice and hurt others, right? And avoidance and withdrawal, you have people who say like, I know I'm feeling something, but it's not a priority to talk about. It's not a priority to address. Like I'm not going to nourish or nurture this thing that is hurting. So with community programming, what you can do and what can grow is a space for young people to come and say, this is something that I'm either passionate about, or this is something that I need, or that I'm curious about. And the consequence can be drastic, right? It can be suicide. It could be the school to prison pipeline. It could be unhealthy relationships and the normalizing of unhealthy relationships. The grooming of young women and girls in the GTA to then be a part of human trafficking or unconsensual sex work is happening. So I can list these consequences and more that break our heart, but I truly believe as a society, we are all contributing to. So these consequences, if this is not your own child or your own family or your own blood, you might see that these consequences don't affect you. But as a society, if we can say that every young person who commits suicide is my family, and that I, as an adult or somebody who has privilege, can step into a role to support somebody, the truth is we can be a solution to preventing somebody who commits suicide, right? If a young person is not engaged with a circle of support, if they don't have family members, or if they don't yet have chosen family, being able to connect to community resources is that stepping stone for them to realize, whatever I've been raised with does not have to be the whole world. Whatever I've known up until today does not have to be the way moving forward and the way I create my future. When we look specifically at community programming and its connection to race and racism, even amongst young people, the lateral violence of race or shadism, or the conversations of, your skin is too dark, or you speak with an accent, or, X, Y, and Z person is prettier because of these X, Y, and Z European features, right? So like even amongst young people, the access to community programming could be that first place where they start to think about how they are themselves either contributing to these things or be aware of how they are also experiencing these hurts. With community programming, it could be such a small thing that really opens a door for young people, right? It could be a once a week program. It could be camp that they went to for 1 week. It could be knowing that there's an adult ally in their school. So the consequences of not having the programming is really a life or death thing for some people. And the consequence also, if they choose to stay alive, but then, maybe not work through some of those issues, it could be just normalizing and accepting that they're going to go through world being shit on, or that people are going to treat them a certain way and that's what's to be expected. So if those are the consequences, the solutions that can come from community programming is letting young people know that, they are valued, that they matter, that their voice matters, right? If every teacher they've had in school has belittled them, someone in community programming could be the first voice that tells them you are special, your voice matters. And I think for a lot of young people, they don't, like this idea of like, do I choose to go to school? Like, am I consenting to go to school? Right? Like, that's not where they're at. Like being a part of a school board or this institution is not what they are consenting to. So how do we support young people who have to go through something that they don't consent to, right? Community programming might be the first place that they can start having these conversations and open up into a world that is so much more beautiful and resilient than this box of schooling. I am currently 28 years old. When I was in school, I had my ups and downs, but when I left school and did post-secondary, I found that there was a bigger pattern of conform, a bigger pattern of, you know, agree with white supremacy, a bigger pattern of leave what makes you unique at the door before you come in. So because of that, you know, I went to college and I walked out. I went to university and I walked out. I've been able to find jobs and relationships and work with amazing people, but it's not my education that gets me through the door. It's my heart, it's the relationships. So if we can have more young people connected to community resources, even if school is trying to break them down, avoiding these really drastic consequences is possible by having a space that holds them with care and allows them to see how they can keep building themselves up and connect to community and to chosen family. And again, be able to say that, like, you know, whatever I've been through till today does not have to be the same script moving forward.
Thank you. And I feel like we should have all been taking copious notes because you shared a lot of valuable information. And I think it's really important for us to just even highlight that underpinning of the importance of like community care, like the idea of like collectivity, the idea of like it takes a village, right? And school isn't just like learning in a brick building, right? School is the school of life, right? They call it that for a reason, like, and that interconnected play between being able to find and cultivate that space within like an academic environment, but also within a community context. And the reality is that, like, you know, children and youth are in community with each other, and they go to programs and have access to resources. So, you know, part and parcel of schools just to be able to connect to those resources and have those resources and support students in an academic school environment are also critical. And like what you said in terms of attack self, attack other, avoidance and withdrawal. Like, you know what I mean? No one, like I always say, like, no one decides to wake up one day and say, hey, I'm going to join a gang. Like, there's steps that someone takes to get there, and they probably go through all those steps before they make that decision in terms of the idea of being able to thrive and survive too as well, right? And so really looking about like how are you centering like the voice of the youth? Like how community informed? If you're looking at your youth and children in your school environments as community, like how informed is your community? How informed are you in terms of like taking that community approach and implementing that approach in your classrooms, like, and implementing that approach in your curriculum, and really thinking outside of the box of different ways you could show up for your students and for their parents and for the broader community. So I really want to thank you for really like highlighting and touching on those points. We have a couple.
Can I just add one? Yeah, just like, I guess, you know, to highlight a positive aspect of that as well, you know, for me, myself, like, there's many faces around this table that have been a part of my village and my chosen family, right? And I'm 28 now, and some of the folks around the room I've known for over 10 years, right? And each of those people to me is an example of how to do things differently, is an example of how to be resilient, is an example of how to embody leadership from the heart, but also encompass all these things, right? And we just need more of that in society, you know, today more than ever.
And I agree. And I think that goes back to what Cherilyn said before, like schools can make that choice, right? And individually and collectively here, like we each individually can make that choice in terms of how we want to show up, right? And then collectivity, like collective wise, like as a collective, we can collectively make that decision in terms of how we want to show up and how we want to support, right? Go ahead, Cherilyn.
I think the thing that I want to add when I was listening to you speak, it was like fire, is that when we don't have those connections, for some of our students, it's life and death. And I'm going to be real with that. I mean, I've been in education for 20 years. I have lost 35 students to gun violence. Every last one of them was a Black male. Every last one of them. I don't watch the news because I always think I don't want to hear who passed, and I wait until somebody calls me to tell me. 35. And that's not students I kind of knew. Like, you know, when I know of somebody, students I knew who could contact me. As principal at my last school, I was known for going into community. I teach hip hop dance lessons and beatbox and things. Like it's not a normal principal thing, but I don't care because it was my way of going to community center to extend myself to say, hey, I have other things that I can offer to build relationship. When students didn't come to school, I would knock on doors and hear, do you know whose door you're knocking on? Those kids are shooters, you would hear. And I would say, no, those kids are kids. Like I don't understand the label, but those kids are kids. And I think the one thing is, when they're with us in school, we almost write a narrative of this is who you're going to become. So if you're engaged in behavior that we deem as not acceptable, that's what you're going to become. But because my relationships are so important to me, what I learn is when they leave the confines of the education system and the confines and labels that we place on them, so many of my students who have had the opportunity to live change because we're no longer judging them. We're no longer siloing them. We're no longer putting them in programs that don't work to serve them. They're free. They're free. And they're allowed to figure out all of these things that we don't grant them the opportunity to figure out. So school plus community plus relationship, if we don't do that right, it really is, it's life and death. And I've seen it too many times.
I just want to sit with that number 35, right? I mean, I've lost students, I've lost family, 35. Like, that's probably the age of some of the people on this call. That's a classroom. And that's really sad. And I think that, I really want to really emphasize, again, just being able to form those connections and really, like, I've had students that I taught 10 years ago, like I worked with 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that to this day will come to my kids' basketball games because I was that person who believed in them or pushed for them or whatever. Like they'll be like, you're in Brampton, miss, I'm coming. And I have students who now have children who like check for me and like I'm their auntie to their children, right? And that goes back to the whole entire idea of like that circle of care, like that whole entire idea of like cultivating community. And just because that's not your child, like, does it end there? Like, how are you showing up? Like, and we all have the collective responsibility to show up. We all have the collective responsibility to knock on doors, or we can sit here and just talk about the number 35 for the rest of this call, right? And I think this would be a really good way. I see that lots of people are putting some stuff in the chat, and I see some really great answers popping up in the chat. I just want to open up some questions generally to anybody who wants to. Feel free to answer them on the panel. And then again, just a reminder, if you have any additional questions, we'll be like more than happy to welcome them and I'll ask them away. But for anybody who wants to answer, what resources are available for parents, educators, for community workers and for youth? Because we talked a lot about some of the challenges, right? And I think it'd be really great before we end this conversation to also talk, because I'm seeing some questions coming in, especially from some parents, about supports that they need, right? And if there are parents on this call, or even teachers who know of parents who might be in need, or community workers on this call who know of people who might be in need, it'd be really great for us to be able to find ways to like flag some of the resources that are available for like parents, even educators, community workers and youth. Anybody want to take that one?
I'm just going to say I can put in the link or in the chat a link to a couple of few articles that might be helpful for parents to provide some tips on how to talk with your children, how to support children, how to validate their experiences. It gives you tips on how to build, how to help children navigate these systems, school system institutions when they're faced with racism, and what kinds of strategies might be helpful for themselves. Probably my colleagues could speak to some other community resources.
Thank you, Bernice.
Better than I could.
Who wants to take that one? Julia, I see you going.
Hi. I just, not to like do a new leaf plug, but that's what's happening briefly, not on purpose though, but I find if you're an educator, I mean, even if you're a parent and you have a bit of a mind-body practice, I find our online reaching out education, the anti-oppression education, very accessible, and we offer sliding scale as well at times. So I think that it's a really accessible way to sort of understand anti-oppression, start to look at internal biases, so ways that you yourself have, what that means, like view the world in ways that, to relook at the world, notice limiting beliefs, as I mentioned earlier. It does focus on trauma-informed mind-body practices, but I truly believe if that's something that you are sort of diving into, it's a really great and accessible method to begin learning more about how to engage with youth, also to learn about the way that youth show up and the ways that maybe we've been mislabeling youth within classrooms, whether that is a tired youth or the way we look at reactivity or impulsivity, and just taking more of a strengths-based approach. And when we use that strength-based approach lens, it helps us, and it really, really does like open the door for our youth to grow in healthier spaces. So can someone just type that in for me though, the like reaching out, and because I can't.
I also could say like, I love our training, but I feel like, especially for parents of young kids, I'm going to drop this link in the chat there. It's a podcast on NPR that's just about talking about race with young children. Because I think we're really afraid to talk about race. Some folks were talking about fragility in the chat and fear. And, on the NPR podcast, they're like, kids are noticing race at 2. At 2 years old, kids are noticing race. Who's attributing value to who? Yes, Bernice is like early childhood education, like at 2. So I think the more that we get comfortable, like, Cherilyn was like, we got to get over our fear, right? And getting over our fear is like remembering our commitment. Like, what's our commitment? Our commitment is to be an adult ally. Our commitment is to be a part of advocacy. And I think really stretching our own capacity to just like talk comfortably and be not afraid to have those conversations, because then the kids actually are like, oh, this is a thing we don't talk about. They really understand that. And I think digging into your own limitations is your own limiting beliefs. Like, we all have to do that work. I wrote that white fragility is an obstacle, and like, yes. And also like, we all internalize white supremacy, right? Julia talked about how like it's happening across races. Arabi talked about how it's happening across shadeism, colorism, like, as someone who's half South Asian, half African, like that is really, bleaching cream is all over the world. And I think one of the things that I really had to face in myself in working with New Leaf was like being cool with kids who weren't graduating, right? And like my own stuff about like, you have to graduate, or like, you know, like I come from an immigrant family and my mom is like she's a school professor. And I grew up with this like drive to get a bunch of degrees, pressure. And I really had to be in the classroom with New Leaf youth and be like, you know, you're not graduating. What are other things that you're into? Like, and check my own stigma around not graduating. It's really work for all of us to do. And I also just, I'm so glad you brought this up, Arabi, like the grooming that's happening in Toronto, young femme women who are getting pulled into human trafficking. I think, like, you know, as a New Leaf instructor, this is something you see. And if there have been experiences where students have been comfortable sharing that, and then we really have to like resource up as a team, right? Because the instructor themselves is like, I have no idea what to tell this young person, where to point them. And then we all have to get involved. And I think, you know, trying to think about, who does this young person trust? Like, let's start there, right? And really starting to face these tough challenges the kids are facing, whether it's not graduating or whether it's being groomed by some trafficker. Like, these things are really happening, and we have to get more comfortable talking about everything so that we can just be in conversation. Because the minute we're like, the kid will shut down, you know? I've had to really relax my face when I work with youth. Youth will disclose something and I'll be like, you know, and I have to be like, just stay calm, just stay calm, you know? And because that reaction will gauge whether or not that youth wants to keep talking to you about not graduating, about being groomed, about having sex, about whatever it is. And I've had to really learn, like, okay, you know, and then also next week, that kid might not want to talk to me, this youth. I keep saying kid, I don't know how that feels and how that's landing, but how this youth might not want to talk to me because they disclosed all this stuff and they have disclosure guilt, right? And maybe they don't come to class, right? And it's really our ability to like be comfortable and in conversation, whether it's about any range of things that we do or do not know, is a great place to start.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bernice.
Thank you. I was going to jump in because, race differences, children recognize, as you said too, and someone put in the chat, as young as 6. There's been all kinds of research by Dr. Kang Lee at University of Toronto, who also talks about the fact that what children recognize as differences, but they learn to differentiate, or they start to attach meaning and start to develop racial, oppressive kind of, discriminative, stereotypical kind of behaviors because they learn it from the adults around them. So basically they start to look at the adult in their environment and see that, oh, my mom is looking at this person funny, so there must be something wrong with them. So they start to develop these, again, negative images because that's what they're seeing in front of them. So how do we interrupt that kind of thinking is, as an early child educator, we're always telling our students about creating inclusive spaces. I mean, I'm just thinking about, my child, and when he was young, he's 31 now, but when he was young, about, you said it, Rebeckah, earlier, about giving him permission to be himself and to feel validated and to give him positive images of himself. And so we talk about that with our students, about creating positive spaces, inclusive spaces, and not trying to shut down children, not trying to silence them, and to really develop a sense of empathy and understanding and acceptance, and that differences are not, again, differences are differences, and to recognize that and to acknowledge that. There's all kinds of great programs, and the New Leaf resources around resiliency and, again, how to be in your body. What always impressed me I'm kind of all over the place because I'm now gushing with all kinds of thoughts. Sorry. But when I first met New Leaf, what really struck me, what impressed me was the authenticity. And, you know, people were so welcome and so open and were so able to be vulnerable and real and truthful about who they were and how they really wanted to be present and to show up for the youth. Well, the same applies for children. Right? And to help early child educators find that same space and to be in that same place with young children and to create those programs. Because what happens is, you know, my thing is about the fact that this starts really young and that young children start to develop all of these attitudes and start to feel like there's something wrong with them, but also start to look at their peers and think there's something wrong with their peers because they're watching the way the educators interact with them. They're watching the way the teachers respond to their peers. And then they start to think that that's okay. And there is something wrong with that child because the teacher's looking at them funny and talking to them funny. So how do we then strengthen parents? How do we help parents to, how do we empower and enable parents to be advocates for their children, to be advocates for themselves? And there's all kinds of programs, I guess, now in some of the more quality early child education centers where they have more parent involvement, more parent supports, more collaboration with parents, and they start to stop judging parents and start, you know, really recognizing the value of parents and that parents are important. They're the most important person in the child's life. And so instead of undermining them is to really support them. So, you know, I didn't want to sound too theoretical and keep talking about the theory says and the research says. I just know from my own experience, it was an uphill battle, constantly reaffirming my son, constantly telling him that he was okay, constantly challenging the teachers and the education system, and you know, not being that angry mother that was always, you know, advocating and, you know, constantly trying to, you know, push the envelope and giving him permission to do that. But I also am aware, and what the research says is you got to have people in your lives who are holding you up. You got to have other parents who can support you and to validate you when you feel like, because it's crazy making where like, I think they said, you know, that sounded racist. Like, is that right? Did I really hear that? Because a teacher will be like, oh, don't be so sensitive. Oh, you know, I'm just talking from my own experience. And it's like, wait a minute, but I have experience, I have knowledge, and I know what my son is capable of. Like, what are you talking about? But if I didn't have other people say, no, you know, what you saw was right. Like, you're true. Like, it's true. What you saw was right. Like, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. You're not crazy. I'd be like, oh, okay, thank you. Because like, I thought I was being too sensitive the way they were speaking to me, you know? So, you know, I could keep going on, but I don't want to dominate the conversation because I know there are lots of other folks on who have other perspectives.
I'll go very quickly. For parents and teachers or anyone dealing with young people, please don't assume they're straight. Like, it just goes a really long way. And the gender people were assigned with at birth might not be what they identify with, right? So you can be a part of supporting that journey, or you can be a part of telling them that, you know, they should stay in the closet. And if you as a parent or a teacher, like, that makes you uncomfortable, there's lots of people who identify as LGBTQ or queer themselves who would be happy to have that conversation with you and those young people as well.
Thank you. We have some recommendations around for specifically supporting Indigenous youth, using the friendship centers, for instance, with being able to do that intergenerational work with elders and youth too as well. I'm hearing a lot from everybody's answers around like really being intentional in terms of checking your privilege. Even as someone who has multiple intersectionalities, when I walk into community, I always acknowledge the privileges that I know where I came from, but I also acknowledge the privileges that I have in terms of access to, you know, a post-secondary education. I live in a relatively nice neighborhood. I you know what I mean? Like, community sees all these kinds of things too as well. The way that you speak and Jamilah, like, I totally can relate to that whole entire thing of sometimes when youth do see you as that safer space for them to disclose information, like, you know what I mean? that might be the only opportunity between what Cherilyn had highlighted before, life and death, right? For someone to come forward to share and like really unpack. So I really think that, you know, really looking at that also from the perspective of not just power, but also looking at it from the perspective is it's a privilege for someone to be able to come to you and share whatever they're going through, or share or disclose information. And sometimes we as adults kind of disclose that. I think one of the most difficult conversations I had with my son recently, and he's 20, my oldest son, sorry, and he's 20, was that he said, like, you know, what do I do when I see the world trying to steal my joy? Right? And so he's just like, we had this really, really interesting conversation. He's just like, I just got to a place where I began to feel not happy because the world around me was telling me all these things about myself, right? And like, what do I do when the world is trying to steal my joy? They're telling me that I'm dangerous, that I can't even go outside for a run. I can't even, like, you know what I mean, occupy these different spaces. I can't even go look at birds in a park without someone calling or threatening my like being threatened by my presence enough to threaten my presence, right? And so, you know, that was like a very hard conversation for me to be able to have with my child, because as a mother, like, you want your children to always cultivate that space of joy, right? And so, you know, thinking about that from that perspective of like, my goal in life is to make my boys not one of those 35, right? But in order for my boys not to make it to be one of those 35, like, all of us have a role to play in that, right? And all of us need to be held accountable, because I can cultivate as much space as I want, but when they walk out those doors, like, it's a whole different kind of territory, and it's a whole different kind of turf war, right? When it comes down to things, and we really need to be cognizant of that. And I think this is a really good segue into the question around, like, what can parents and guardians do when they recognize, like, Bernice, you kind of hinted at it already, but like, when their children have been victimized by oppressive systems and structures, and what do you see the role of educators, youth workers, and community workers in creating anti-oppressive, anti-racist environments?
I'm gonna quickly jump in. I think one of the biggest things as a community leader, educator, supporter, youth worker, and parent, and it kind of stems off what you were saying, Rebeckah, is the concept of rupture and repair. I think when we hold youth as doing something and they kind of get stuck with that thing, I can't count the amount of times, whether it is, you know, look, weed is legal now, but for example, you know, growing up, if someone had like a small portion of weed, how does that determine someone's entire life from that place? So this concept of rupture and repair, it's like, we need to be in forming less oppressive systems. We need to really, really, really be holding youth up to like reconcile versus keeping them in a certain place. So as an educator, and this also goes with like quote unquote behavioral issues, if someone's working through anger, if they haven't yet learned to communicate their emotions because it's never been safe to do so, it's up to us to be bigger and to hold space for that versus just pigeonholing them into like a diagnosis or a label. That's rupture and repair. That our relationship may have gone awry, we may have had a disagreement, you may have cussed me out, you know? Just because you cussed me out doesn't mean that now you're a bad youth. And why it would be very different if it was, you know, a youth with more privilege, if it was a youth that spoke a certain way, or the ways that, you know, we deem access and we deem privilege. So it's very important that we are allowing the same room for opportunity and growth and rupture and repair. So that's just what I want to leave for everyone.
I just want to add, I'm going to write it in the chat as well. Can you hear me? Sorry, I had some difficulties. I just want to prepare parents, guardians, caregivers in the room with some tools that you can use when you find that your individuals are being oppressed or schools being oppressive. And I think use the words that they have in writing to hold them accountable, which looks like, I work for the Toronto District School Board. We have so much messaging. If you go on the website, type in equity, type in anti-Black racism, type in oppression, type in Indigenous, Indigenous mandates and beliefs, type in, gender, type in pronouns, type in human rights, type in all of those buzzwords and read what the board, for example, I would read what the board says about those things, and that's going to be my weapon. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to speak to somebody in power. It might look like me, it might not. And I will say, on your board in the multi-year strategic plan, it says such and such. Can you explain how you're upholding such and such when this and that happened? Can you explain how you are going to uphold such and such? Can you, and then what you're going to do is you're going to make sure that you're on school council, because school council is filled with parents and individuals who have clout and power because they're in my ear saying, hey, your school should run like this and that. You're going to make sure you put yourself there. And if you can't go there in person, you're going to say, well, great, can I call in? Okay, great, can I get the notes? Okay, because we need to make sure we have different ways for you to be a part of that. And then if that doesn't work, you're going to go above me. You're going to go above the principal. You're going to go to the superintendent. And I say that because, Rebeckah had said, I have people who check for me now who used to be, my students, and that's exactly it. There are so many instances where I have students who now have children who say, Scobes, and they call me Scobes or Scobie, such and such is happening, what do I do? And I say, great, you're gonna go on this website with me and I'm gonna give you the language. So I give you the language. You're gonna repeat this sentence and it's gonna sound like you said it. Don't sound like Scobie, you need to sound like you. And then they practice. But miss, if I'm not miss, I'm Scobie, you're grown. Okay, great, next. You're gonna take this website down and this email address down and you're gonna write, in the multi-year strategic plan, it says, and in this class, this happened to my child. And how in the world is that and that's what you're going to use their own words that they have in writing to hold them accountable, which means whatever our board says, I hold myself accountable. That doesn't mean that everyone does that, but I do, because this is about young people and I don't want to be in the business of hurting young people. And those words are powerful. When you show an individual or a group of individuals that they're not doing what their organization says they're supposed to do, fire starts to burn. So if I'm not doing it, you go above me. If I'm ridiculous and doing foolishness, you go above me. And you call my superintendent, Debbie Donsky, and you say, Debbie, Cherilyn, Scobie is a hot mess. And then Debbie says, okay, Cherilyn, what's the deal? And I have to get my act together. And that's a process that actually works. So I'm not just saying it, it's the process that works. The end.
Honestly, literally, we went to church again. But more importantly, too, I feel like we're just going to call that, we're going to merge what Julia and Scobie said. I'm going to say Scobie, okay? Together, we're going to call it Scobie's 5-point action plan to rupture and repair. That's exactly what it is. And I can personally attest to, I am that person who has taken the time to go and do the research and come back at people with their language. And people get hella uncomfortable when you come back at them and you're like, well, you said this, or you have an anti-racism committee, but yet you did this, right? And also share that knowledge and resource with other parents with regards to that too as well. And so I mean, we're gonna share a lot of these resources that are popping up in the chat. Laura said that it will come out in an email, so you'll have that, and we'll probably also highlight that idea of rupture and repair and how important it is, not just in school environments, because again, school is just a structure that exists in all these other structures that are systematic forms of oppression, right? So that idea of rupture and repair, for me, shows up in wellness. The idea of rupture and repair can show up in healthcare. The idea of rupture and repair can show up in many different iterations in many different spaces too as well. Right? And so that's something that we could probably take away We have like 3 more minutes before we start to wrap up this conversation and to say our thank yous and whatnot. I'm going to try to get in one more little question because I always try to like, I think time is a colonial construct, so, you know. One more question. So if anybody wants to take this one, why is it important for New Leaf as a youth serving organization, as for other youth workers, educators, and caregivers, to incorporate anti-oppression training and an awareness of power and privilege into their work? I think that's a really good way to end this conversation. Jamilah?
Yeah, I could jump in. I mean, I really just think, I also see Julia. I think if you want to be trauma informed, oppression is trauma. If you want to be inclusive, if you want to be open to experiences that you don't know, that's important to you as a person in the world. If you want to be kind, if you're like a mindfulness person and you're into loving kindness, you should do Anti-O. If you want to be mindful, mindfulness is noticing what's happening. That's an easy way to think about mindfulness. If we're noticing what's happening in the world around us, okay, it's time to like think about dismantling systems and structures of oppression, to think about how we participate in those, how we could either be a part of interrupting those systems or perpetuating those systems. So yeah, I think it's like just wanting to be a part of listening, a part of participating, and a part of change. That's all I'll say.
Anybody else? Julia? Did you want to add? I saw your hand go up. Sorry, I missed it. No?
I just wanted to just share this. Interestingly enough, the American Academy of Pediatrics has now actually come out with a position paper around anti-oppression, anti-racism, recognizing that it is, it plays a role in children's health and children's well-being and health. I thought that was quite remarkable that, you know, the American Academy of Pediatrics is even recognizing that. So
that's important, and I think for all the educators on this call, that's really important. Julia, go ahead, hon.
I will end with this. I think it's important. I'm just going to humanize it for us all for a minute. I know I'm always continuing to learn, so I think that, you know, people hear the word anti-oppression and it can seem like something really big. And for example, in our work, when we're teaching trauma informed, I think Laura says it, she's like, it's people informed. If my experience is like this, then I'm not going to be able to see your experience. And so anti-oppression for me is like, you know, our, you know, capitalism, colonization, westernization, we may only be able, or like be bought, sold, and taught this. So anti-oppression is a way to like see bodies differently, see races differently, see gender differently, sexuality differently. And even me who like study and I'm so into it, it's like, there's always somebody's voice you haven't heard, you know? There's always a story to learn and a perspective that has been silenced. And so it's just so important to for us to all continually learning and growing and expanding our minds, because youth will always present in different ways. So it's our job, you know, to grow. And instead of looking at it as like someone's trying to change my beliefs, no, it's like you're expanding your belief, because you're giving your own youth and youth around them the opportunity to like really be themselves when you do anti-oppression work.
That was beautiful. She's my neighbor, almost. I still owe you a walk, Julia. But honestly, I think that Julia hit the nail on the head in terms of just really acknowledging the fact that it's our collective responsibility, right? It's our collective responsibility to acknowledge. It's our collective responsibility to unpack. It's our collective responsibility to change those systems and structures, or else these systems and structures are going to continuously be in place. With that said, being mindful of the time, Rochelle, go ahead, hon.
Mike, I'm sorry. I'm going to come on really quickly because I have a quick question. I know we don't have that much time, but I really want to get a little bit more specific into what we were just talking about. But how can relative parents advocate for youth in spaces? And I know that we were talking about it as a community thing, but I really want us to come out with something for that, if that's possible.
So we teach, there's like 3 modes of power. You can witness power, you can exercise power, you can experience power. And I think witnessing is something that's really important, right? So if I'm a big fan of Mandy Harris Williams, who likes to be identified as a critical pop star. And Mandy Harris Williams says, attend to your locus of control. So if you're in a space and you see youth being oppressed, I think, you know, this is a moment where you could be like, hi, hello, excuse me, right? And I like to think about if this is like an instance where I'm watching something happen and I want to jump in, I like to direct myself to the person who I'm concerned about, who I think is being harmed. I'm not trying to like talk to the harmer because that might escalate the situation. I'm trying to direct my attention to the person who's being harmed, and I try to encourage them as agents of their own experience. So I don't jump in and assume I know what's going on. I'd be like, hey, are you okay? Is there something I can do? And I let that youth tell me, this is what's going on, this is what I need, and this is how you can be of service. That's all I will offer on that.
I also kind of think too, you know, being able to share yourself as that resource, right? Being able to also provide the space to go into these spaces and articulate too as well, right? And definition of like guardian or parent, it's, for me anyway, it shows up very fluid, right? If you're it doesn't matter if you're my kid, like I birthed you, you're my child. No matter proximity to me, you're my child. And so like the same way I would show up for my kids is the same way I show up for every other person's kids. And I think that even just having that general understanding of it takes a village, right? And being able to find ways to be able to go in and support or even offer, you know, maybe that parent, like Cherilyn, I'm just gonna start calling you Scobie, sorry, my bad. But like Cherilyn had said before around like going online and using this language, maybe it's like having a workshop session where like you gather some parents and say, this is where you find this is where you find that, or printing up those resources. There's many different ways and iterations that, you know, I think that we can all kind of find ways to show up for community and offer that support, and even supporting and advocating for programs such as New Leaf, not to plug New Leaf, but such as New Leaf, to be in school environments. A way, again, is another way for us to be able to kind of like show up differently for community too as well, and support those parents and those youth too as well. Does anybody else have anything to add before we wrap it up? Okay, well, I hate to say goodbye, but it is that time. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight. It was a very enlightening and powerful conversation. And I've learned so much, and I'm really happy and honored to have like been a part of just even being here tonight, moderating this conversation. I want to also thank the Atkinson Center for Society and Children Development for the support of the event, and to Lululemon's here to be programmed for partially funding this panel series. And just note, I said series, so there'll be more of these conversations, which is really great because now we have something to look forward to. So something will be coming up in November. Pay attention, keep your eyes posted and peeled. And if you're not following New Leaf Yoga on social media, follow so you can get updates, and we'll put that in the chat. And I just want to leave everybody with this blessing to walk away with, which is, may the vibrations of truth, light, and love in this space at this time exude and be sown into our hearts, manifested in our lives, and practiced in our communities all around the world. Ashe. Thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great and beautiful night.